will automatically stay recording,
Okay.
and I think that's fine.
Okay. I might move around though, just so you're aware.
That's fine. Just get louder
Yeah.
if you walk away.
Yeah, that's fine. So I feel like yeah, I like moving around. So I do just for a little context. So I appreciate Stefan giving me an intro and just talking about the fact that yeah, we have been friends for like at least 15 plus years. And it's just funny how that's all come together. I do just for a little background on myself. I might look like I'm 25. I'm actually 40 years old. Back in October was my 40th birthday, and currently I serve over at Calvary Chapel Fellowship in St. Petersburg. So it's under Pastor Danny Hodges. So if you know the St. Pete area, it's going to be like US 19 and 17th Avenue North. So there's a church out there. I help out with children's church. I'm one of the lead teachers over there. There's 3 other teachers, and we have the 2 first and second service, and we kind of rotate out to help manage the workload. So I'm heavily involved there. So my style of teaching is going to be more towards the way I'm used to or accustomed to of children's church, but we'll keep it more to the adult level. I also help out on Thursday nights. There's a mutual friend me and Stefan have, Noah Schmidt. He's the young adults pastor at another church called Central Christian over near Tyrone Square Mall. So I'm also there on Thursday nights, and then I'm also plugged into a couple of men's breakfasts that are usually the youngest ones, like 55 plus individuals. So I kind of find myself hopping between the different age groups that way. And so just kind of funny how the Lord has kind of like dropped me into these different spots. So, but that brings us to here this morning. So definitely grateful for the opportunity to step in. And Stefan, of course, is a fantastic teacher, and I definitely look up to him. And I'm thankful for the opportunity to be able to step into his shoes here a bit here and get to share with you guys as we continue with the study on the book of Ephesians. And so with the book of Ephesians in particular, we see that Paul is talking about what it looks like to be a Christian as we're kind of in the moment in the section of the book here going into chapter 6. And so one of the big things we have to keep in mind as Christians is that being a Christian is not a sprint. It's not something like you just do and it's going to be done like in 30 days later and you're like, oh, done. I've done my work for the rest of my life. I'm free from any future obligations. It's an endurance run. And it's one of those things that, it's the daily laying down ourselves, taking up the cross, and putting Christ first. And so we have to make decisions and choices along the way, and those choices are going to be formed by the patterns we pick up along the way in this endurance run. So how they talk about certain behaviors endurance runners have, like how they run, certain motions of their arms or certain breathing patterns will determine their success. Are they going to come out first, or are you going to come at the back of the pack, at the end of this 20-mile race or whatever you have going on? And so one of the most important behaviors, of course, as a Christian is Bible reading. If we're going to endure this race to the end and be victorious, we really got to make sure the Bible is at the front and center of our investment of our time, our energies, really allowing that to have its molding and forming effect on our thought life. And so one of the people I read currently a lot of is A.W. Tozer. This was an individual who did a lot of writings back in the 50s and 60s. He's gone on to be in glory, so I'm envious of where he is currently, but he left a lot of good writings and teachings for us to reflect on. And so when it comes to the topic of, okay, I'm make sure I go upside down. When it comes to the topic of obedience, and that's specifically where we are in the book of Ephesians, he has a comment that I read recently that I really enjoyed. So one of the books I just finished reading is called The Next Chapter After the Last. So the idea being, like our life is just the preface to the greater story yet to be told in all eternity with God and in heaven's presence. But Tozer will make the comment stating that when it comes to the Bible in particular, there's a threefold purpose of the Bible, and that is to inform us, to inspire faith, and to secure obedience. And this is going to be the most defining thing about us, like as Christians, is how we are obedient to the Lord. Whenever it is used for any other purpose, it is used wrongly and may actually do harm. The Holy Scriptures will do us good only as we present an open mind to be taught, a tender heart to believe, and a surrendered will to obey. And it's the Bible from Genesis to the failure of Adam and Eve in the garden, all the way to the book of Revelation. It's just one story after another about obedience. Like, are we going to do it right and follow after the Lord? Or are we going to say, I'm going to, in my own wisdom and what I think is right in my own eyes, I'm going to go in this direction, go in the opposite way. And that's going to chart out the course of success and failure in our lives. And we'll see some of that in today's talk as well. But obedience, it's a solid, very essential topic that we have to make sure we get right, because it's going to determine our success and failure in significant ways. So I just wanted to touch on briefly, as we are continuing in Ephesians, just the overall structure of what the book of Ephesians is about. So we see, and Stephen did a great job in the first 3 chapters in particular. There's a lot of theology there, a lot of big words that people can get tripped up on. But it's talking about our identity, who we are in Christ. So the idea of like we're seated in Christ. He brings all these blessings. He brings this work in us and salvation, and everything. And so there's a lot about who we are in Christ as a result. And so there's the idea of like your seating, like where you're seated before the Lord. And so that's what chapters 1 through 3 are really going to hit on. And you'll see the phrase "in Him" 9 different times is really being detailed out, and just that repetition of that idea. We're right now in the middle section, so what we refer to as the walk. And how do we walk out this Christian life in a way that honors the Lord and in a way that's going to be able to bring blessings in our life, not just financially, but the Lord blesses in so many various ways. And so we're right at the tail end of the walk section, but there's different teachings, different points Paul is making about like how do you walk this life out successfully. And then next week you'll have the opportunity to pick up the last key section there about standing, like once you've done everything, to stand firm in the truth and what God has called you to. And of course, that's the famous armor of God teaching you'll get into. But it's sitting in who we are, walking this life out, and then once you've done everything, to stand and to be firm about your convictions as a result that have been settled in your heart. And so, looking at the walking section, there are 5 different references to walk in this section of where we're in right now. And I like to highlighting out the word walk in particular is because so much of what we're going to talk today is about obedience. Children being obedient to their parents, servants being obedient to their masters, is you can, in your mind, you can swap out the word walk with obey. So you can see here, we should obey in a manner that's worthy of our calling. We should obey, we should no longer, this one I was slightly switched to, no longer disobey, like as the Gentiles do. So we want to live in a way that we're honoring God correctly. We want to obey in love to the Lord. We want to obey as children of the light. And we want to look carefully how we obey, to be wise in our obedience to the Lord. And so just kind of swapping that out because obedience is our big topic. So with that, I'm going to pause for a second, keep us there. I'm going to go ahead and, if you guys want to turn to Ephesians chapter 6, we're going to read through verses 1 through 9. And I'm going to go ahead and read through the text because technically I could just read the 9 verses and we can call it a day. Like it's very clear, generally speaking, like here's what we're supposed to be doing. We'll go ahead and we'll do a more deeper dive in the nuances and everything, but the teaching on a plain surface is very straightforward. So looking at Ephesians chapter 6, starting in verse 1, we read here from Paul, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him." And so you can see the relationship dynamics that are being laid out here. So last week, you guys talked about husbands to wives, wives to husbands relationship. Here we're talking children to parents, parents to children, servants to masters, masters to servants. We're going to be in one of these relationships, if not multiples of them, throughout our whole life. And so we have to get the balance correct. And how do we manage these relationships in a way that honors the Lord? So the first thing I wanted to back up from with this text is, why do we have to be under authority in the first place? Like, why does God have this structure set up? Why do I have to be submissive? Why can't I just be an island to myself and do whatever I want? Well, as we do read of Jesus, and as he comes and talks to the disciples, he said, the kingdom of God is at hand. The key word being there, it's a kingdom. And as we've seen in all the medieval movies and everything, every kingdom has rank, there's order, there's delegated authority. You can't just choose who your leaders are, but there's a leadership, there's a structure. And so we have to accept the fact that this isn't a democracy. You can't just vote who your leaders are. God's going to appoint people to be in certain roles as a king would, as we've seen in medieval times, and even there's certain countries in the world today who still have like a kind of a kingdom setup. And so because it's a kingdom, we have to submit. And so we see here Paul, and specifically with Romans chapter 13, looking at verses 1 and 2, we see that because God's appointed these authorities, we have to be mindful about what that means for us. So Paul breaks out here, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. So this is part of the structure from the beginning when God made Adam and Eve in the garden. There's always been some level of structure. There's always been authority in play. So God gave Adam and Eve authority over the earth, to take care of the animals, even to name them, take care of the garden. And then even, we don't talk about it too much, but even the angels have dominions over certain aspects of our world, over the creation itself. God works through people, angels, humans, in delegating authority. He works with his creation. And so we have to be mindful about that. And so a lot of times people are like, so we got this structure, we're having to be forced to be submitted. And then we're like, why can't I just do what I want? But there is a benefit to having authority. And that, and the primary things being that it does bring protection, it does bring provision, it does bring peace to us, because like we know who we turn to, we have an issue, we have someone who's responsible for our care and our protection and providing for us. And so there is a benefit to authority that we can look to as a result. And so we just have to, again, keep ourselves in a place of submission. And when we try to resist authority and say, like, hey, I know better, I can do this job better than you pretty much are operating out of a sense of pride. And we see in the colorful language of Isaiah 14, that's Satan's original sin. I'm going to ascend above God. I know better. I'll show you how it's done. And of course, he gets just cast straight down out of heaven. So pride is our ultimate downfall. We don't want to copy his terrible example. He wants us to do that, and he wants us to incur judgment from the Lord. But we want to, of course, look at his example and be like, you know what? That didn't work out so well for him. I'm going to go ahead and go in the opposite direction. And so we're called to be in submission. We're called to be under authority. Now, when it comes to the idea of obedience, as we read in the text, there's a lot about obey, obey, obey. This is going to be coupled strongly with the idea of honor. And so as a result, the way we honor someone, generally speaking, it's going to be through obedience. I'm going to honor you by being obedient to what you're asking me to do, what you're guiding me in this path to walk out. And so those two terms tend to be very commingled together. Honoring and obeying come usually together. And so with that, let's jump over to the next slide. Everything's staying up. We see that honor it's a big key thing throughout the Bible. And there's really the principle of honor is what we have to lean into as a Christian. And so we see that honor comes from the outflow of a heart that rightly fears God. If we get the relationship between us and God right, that's going to help impact and help us have healthy relationships with other people horizontally in those horizontal relationships. So if we're fearing God, acknowledging that he's creator, he's Lord, he's king, then we understand we're in a kingdom structure, and I'm going to rightly start to relate to the people around me. So be it the people above me, the people at my same peer level, and the people below me. We're called to honor people in those different spots. One thing you notice, we kind of like, as we briefly jump through the verses 1 through 9 of chapter 6 of Ephesians, but you notice there were references to blessings that would come about as a result of obeying. So we had the children. It talks about, how things may go well for you, that you may live long. It talked about when it came to the bond servants being obedient to the masters, that you will receive back from the Lord blessings. And so God is a rewarder. God loves to give rewards to us. And when we rightly honor people and are obedient to the authority structure he's given us, he wants to bring blessings our way. And so we have a reason, we have a motivation to do so. And one big motivation too, it says, you're doing this level of honor, and you're doing this obedience as unto the Lord. So it's like, hey, as much as I may not like that person, I may not like the way they look, I have to keep in mind, like, they are a representation of Christ. And so I'm serving them as unto Christ, and God is going to honor that and bring rewards as a result. So we just got to get ourselves out of like the present and kind of like remember like who's really behind the person we're honoring at that point. And so we have that going on in our lives. And like I mentioned in the scriptures, it said, like, you'll receive back from the Lord what you've sown. You see that truth echoed by Paul in the book of Galatians. So chapter 6, verse 7, it makes it very clear, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, he will also reap. So if we sow honor, if we sow obedience, we're going to reap blessings. If we choose to say, hey, I'm going to make names and just undermine your authority in my life, you're going to reap judgment. So God is going to honor the principle of honor, as a result, giving blessings and judgment. So we want to be mindful in the steps we take in that as a result. So I wanted to kind of just, before we jumped into the verses and kind of flesh out key ideas, was to really talk about the fact that there is a kingdom, we're under authority, God instituted authority, and if God did it, that means it's a good thing. So God only made things that were good, and even said at the beginning, after the first 6 days of creation, each thing was a good day. These things were good. So we trust God with it. It provides provision, protection, peace to us, and God's going to reward us as we walk out the principle of honor. So with that kind of as a framework, then we jump into the text a little more deeply about what does it mean for children to honor parents and parents to honor their children and us being servants and stuff like that. So when it comes to verses 1 through 3, I'm talking about children and parents. This, of course, you can see in your scripture, you might have a cross-reference. It's hinting back to Exodus 20. Does anybody want to guess what commandment number this one's about when it says honor your mother and your father? Like, chance, does anyone know the commandment offhand? Which number? Eric? No, not number 1. That's honor God first. Was it? Number 3 would be, I'm trying to think here. That's going to be don't use the names vain. No idols, use the names vain. So yeah, number 3 is don't use his name in vain. So but you're close. A couple more down. It makes us 2. Not number 6. Number 6 is to kill. It's 5. Number 5. Yeah. Yeah, number 5. Let's just have fun. I know there's some Bible trivia geeks in here, so you have fun with it. But yeah, number 5. So this is hinting to commandment number 5: honor your father and mother. And even it says back in Exodus 20 that it may go well for you, that you'll be blessed. So the promise that Moses wrote back then still applies to us 6,000 years later. God is unchanging. He's the same yesterday, today, forever. This truth about honoring your parents has gone all these thousands of years, even to the present, as a result. So we see that obedience in the text that Paul wrote in Ephesians is the duty of every child, but where that obedience comes from needs to come from a place of honor. It needs to come from the heart. And if it comes from the heart, that obedience is going to be genuine. It's going to be free of wrong motives. It's going to be free of hypocrisy. You're doing this for the right reasons when you obey someone and not trying to get something out of it, kind of thing. We do, I guess, in one sense, look to get rewards from the Lord, but you're not trying to manipulate that person in your obedience. You're doing it right before them. And so God promises to improve the quality and increase the quantity of one's life when we honor our parents in particular. So we're definitely incentivized to, hey, if we want to make the most of our days here and honoring the Lord and what he's called us to do, honoring our parents is going to be a big area to make that happen, to facilitate that. And so, of course, you can go. I'm going to make some additional verse references. I'm not going to go to them per se for the sake of time, but that's of course going to be talking about raising a child and the way it should go, kind of verse there with Proverbs 1. But yeah, so the children are called definitely to obey, and we'll come back to this because you don't obey 100% everything we're told, but generally speaking, the foundational rule is the children need to obey the parents. The parents are there for their kids' good. They're trying to raise them up to be good citizens, and so we're called to obey our parents. So from there, then we get to the topic of discipline. So discipline it's going to be a big factor in how a parent raises a child. I have to instruct you. I need to correct your behavior. I need to tell you when things are right and when things are wrong. And so this is the calling upon the parent. You need to step into your role to disciple your child, to raise them up. And so discipline is, of course, it's training in which you're going to be an example before them and how you behave. That's going to be how one form of discipline is going to come through. How you exhort them, how you praise them, and how you give proper punishment. So that's all going to be different aspects to raising a child. Of course, I'm more teaching this from mental stakes. I don't have any personal children of my own. I do like an hour a week of children's church, and that's an interesting experience having 20 kids. But the parents are here probably could testify to what I'm saying. I know it's not an easy job whatsoever, and the whole responsibility there. But it's definitely a calling. Your number one mission field is to raise your kids, to really disciple them. So it's a blessing. The Lord, children are a blessing. It's not easy work, but it's a blessing that mission and that work you have there to put those children, to raise them up to serve the Lord. So we see here, Proverbs 29 stating, this discipline your son, and he will give you rest. He will be a delight to your heart. So the whole intent here with disciplining and raising children is that your children should be a blessing to you. They should be a delight. They should not be a source of angst and trouble and just trial and travail. Like, they really should be a blessing to you when it's all said and done. So children are a blessing. We want to raise them right so they can be a blessing to you in the future. Now, when it comes to discipline, we want to make sure the discipline is being done in a way to assure the child that, yes, you made a mistake, but you can learn and grow from this. We're not looking to heap guilt on them for the rest of their days and being like, I'm never going to rise up to my parents' expectations to me. We're not looking to weigh them down. We're trying to encourage them, hey, yes, you messed up here, buddy, but you can do better. We can grow from here. This is not who you are. It's just a step. It's a momentary trip up, but we're going to move forward. We're going to keep growing as a result. So we want to be mindful how we go about with disciplining children. And we want to make sure the discipline is just being swift, being concise, not this looming threat over them for an extended period of time. Like, just hit it, be done with it, let's move forward. We had to do what we had to do, but I love you. We're going to keep growing, and we're going to keep moving together. So we want to be intentional there. And you see in the scripture there specifically when it came to verse 4 in chapter 6 of Ephesians, the saying, the fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. So we want to be intentional that as parents, that we're not unnecessarily exasperating the children through rejection, through inappropriate punishment, through verbal or physical abuse. Like, we got to be mindful of how we engage with them, and so that we don't drive them away. The discipline needs to be done in a loving, encouraging, relationship building approach. So it's going to be very key there. And when we come with dealing with disciplining children, we need to focus on the behavior of the child in that moment. We don't want to attack their character. We don't want to say, you're a good for nothing individual. We want to be like, be hitting your brother and sister, the act of hitting, that's not right. You don't strike out in anger. Not that, you're a hateful child. I wish I didn't have you kind of thing. Like, when you start attacking their character, that type of I'm trying to correct them approach, you're going to have long years worth of emotional damage being brought up on that child that was never intended through discipline. So we want to make sure we focus behaviors, not attacking their character. We want to build up their character. We want to speak life to them and call them up to what God has called them to be as men and women of God, as his prince and princesses in the kingdom. So we want to be mindful how we go about with the discipline. But this also, of course, we're going to see in Scripture where, here's the perfect ideal case. This is how we should be raising our children. Parents don't always get it right, and we want to learn from the mistakes in the Bible. So what do we do in the case of when we fail to discipline rightly? If we fail to make discipline a priority, really to make this a mission, a purpose, like, I'm going to be very intentional about how I discipline my children, failure to discipline is going to bring back severe consequences. And so we see that when we fail to discipline, the parents will become despised. They'll be despised because they didn't bring any discipline whatsoever. They're just like, I don't care. I'm your friend. I'm not your parent. You do what you want. We'll figure this out kind of approach. Or you become overly harsh. You're very, tough. You're very cold towards them. So there's two different ends of the spectrum of how you can cause your children to despise you. Either you're too loose-handed or you're too overly handed towards them. And then you just bring resentment towards you. And so we see here with Proverbs 29:15 here, saying that, the rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. So a classic story that's going to come up in regards to a child bringing shame to their parents is going to be a story of how David dealt with the sin of Amnon against his half-sister Tamar, and then ultimately how Absalom, his other son, will rise up in rebellion against his father because of David's failure to correctly discipline Amnon. So I'm not going to go too deep into the story just for the sake of time, but Amnon does, unfortunately, with all the different children, rapes his half-sister Tamar. Tamar's brother is Absalom. Absalom's very upset what happened to his sister, but David decides, because Amnon is his first son, I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to stay quiet about the matter. He really should have stepped up and disciplined his child and really called out the wrong that was done, but he doesn't. So a couple years go by. Absalom seems nothing's been done to rectify the situation that's happened to his sister, and he's like, you know what? I'll fix the situation. And he goes and murders Amnon. He's like, I'm going to defend my sister's honor. I'll do what my father did not do. And so now we start seeing death being introduced to the family as a result. And then Absalom will step away for a while. He'll come back. David will call him back over, but he never really proactively tries to reconcile with Absalom. He's just kind of like, whatever, just let him do what he wants. But he brings him back. And then because of, again, David not being very proactive with his son, Absalom in this case, Absalom will stage a coup and try to take the kingdom away from David. And there'll be another, David has to flee for his life. Absalom will ultimately find himself hanging from a tree because he had long locks of love of hair. And he'll get speared to death as a result. And so we end up having two of David's sons die deaths that could have been very well avoided if David just had stepped up and disciplined and done what he was supposed to do as a father. But he did not. And so failure to discipline reaps just negative consequences. And so prayerfully won't get to this level, but we do see in the Bible just very clear, like we have to rightly discipline children. It's for their good. They'll thank you when they're in their 30s, like you did right to doing what you had to do in that regard. So don't fear it, lean into it, kind of thing. This also brings us to the topic of the fact that we do live in a fallen world. There is no one who's going to be a perfect parent. The only perfect parent potentially would have been Jesus Christ, but he stayed celibate till he died. So I guess I'm following that footsteps right now. But but it's but no one's a perfect parent. Mistakes are going to be made, and you tell the kid, hey, I'm sorry, and how I handled this one situation. You're not going to be perfect, and even your example will not always be done right. Things are going to happen. You're going to trip up, and God can forgive you and work with you and that type of thing. But so we need to expect the fact that we're going to be imperfect. But just because you're imperfect doesn't mean that your children can now rise up against you. They need to honor you. Like as children, we still need to honor our parents even when they are imperfect and how they go about raising us. And so one particular story that when it comes to children not rightly honoring their parents will be the story of Noah. So as you probably or as you remember, after the flood and everybody gets wiped out, it's just Noah and his 3 kids and their wives. The world starts over with just those 4 couples as a result of the judgment that came on the earth. And at some point, Noah, being a person who was a vineyard before the flood, starts creating grapes again, gets a vine going, and somehow in the new world finds himself drunk and nakedly passed out in his tent. Was that godly behavior for him to allow himself to get drunk and passed out like that? No, that wasn't. He should not have done that. Unfortunately, this is what ended up happening. So it's not the best behavior, but it happened. Unfortunately, Ham, one of his sons, will see this, comes and tells his brothers and mocks the whole situation. People do suggest there might have been more going on, but just the plain reading of scripture says, and he mocked him and tells his brothers about what he saw. And then Japheth and Shem say, hey, this isn't cool. They'll go in there and they're going to cover their father's nakedness with a blanket and not even looking at him. Like, hey, we're just going to cover what happened here and to protect the honor of their father. And Noah's going to wake up and know that what he's going to know either through the Holy Spirit or some type of communication, he's going to know what happened. Ham made fun of him, mocked him in his nakedness. The other 2 sons protected his honor. And so we see here is that when a parent fails, like Noah did, that failure is something God has to address. That's between him, that parent, and God. God will address that behavior. It is not for the children to now step into and think that they can now become God-like and I'm going to judge the situation and take action. That's now you stepped out of your place. You're no longer honoring rightly. And so judgment will come upon Ham. His descendants will be cursed by Noah, and the descendants of Shem and Japheth will be blessed because of them honoring their parents, them honoring Noah. And so we see in this example here that just because our parents fail doesn't mean we have the right to take inappropriate responsive action towards them. So you can be 100% right in saying, hey, you did wrong, and 100% wrong in how you go about addressing that behavior and how you act against them. So we got to keep in mind, so yeah, they're wrong, but we still got to honor them even when they do things that are wrong. So we don't find ourselves on the judgment side like Ham did. And so so we can't blame our bad choices on them. Be like, hey, I did this bad action because you did a bad action. It's like you can't have a rippling chain effect of one bad behavior after another. That's not how this works. Like it needs to stop when it comes to honor. Honor breaks that type of chaining out of bad behavior. So we got to put that first. And again, as we honor them, even imperfect parents, God said he will reward us. So we got to remember the background. Like even in these weird situations, putting God first brings blessing. So kind of touching on those high level points there about children and parents to children brings us to the second half of our passage, starting in verse 5 here, in regards to bond servants. And so we see here the idea, again, not being repeated, not only here in Ephesians 6:5 about serving servants being faithful to their masters. Paul will repeat this theme again in 1 Timothy as a result. So Looking at 1 Timothy 6, verses 1 through 2, we see Paul sharing with them, "Let all who are under a yoke as bondservants regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be reviled. Those, those who have believing masters must not be disrespectful on the ground that they are brothers. Rather, they must serve all the more, or serve all the better, since those who benefit by their good service are believers and beloved." So we see here again the call to us honoring the masters, the people we work under. So if we want to change the terminologies and make it a little more relatable, employee, employer, who your boss is as an employee. So in the workplace, this is where we are today. I am a servant to my boss. And I'm called to honor them and to be responsive to their needs, to their wants, and what they're asking me to do. One key reason we need to be honoring our masters, as we see in 1 Timothy here, is that it brings reviling to God's name and to the teaching of of Christianity when we don't honor our masters. We're bringing disrepute to God and to his teaching. And so one reason we need to really lean into honoring our masters is because it honors God's name and honors his teaching. This is who we are supposed to be defined as people who honor our masters. And so we want to especially serve well to our fellow brothers and sisters in the faith when it comes to serving. Some scriptures or versions of the Bible, I've been using the ESV for the verses I have presented, will have the word, instead of serving, you might see the word slave showing up there. And of course, slavery was a thing back then. But one thing that's kind of interesting from a mindset perspective is how a slave and a servant will approach work. So a slave, having been stolen from their homeland, will generally just do the minimum requirement of them when it comes to their job. And it's one of those things where they kind of like they're forced to do their job. I have to do this, not that I want to. Where if you're a servant, and especially us today, us as people who choose our jobs, we can, who we want to be employed by, we make that choice. A servant has the opportunity to do the maximum potential possible in that position. And it's not so much that I have to do my job, it's that I get to. I elect to be in this role. I choose to do as much as I can. So a servant's going to look for opportunities to serve and then fulfill those opportunities without even being asked. Like, you're very proactive as a servant. Like, I want to fulfill all my master's heart's desires, and whatever I can do to really bless him and to do right by him, I'm going to do that. Where the slave's like, what is the least I can do to get out of this? And I want to go back and just kind of relax and do my own thing. So there's a heart attitude when it comes, especially as Christians. Like, we want to do a really good job, and especially to those who are believers in the faith as well. Not that we're supposed to do it for all masters, but especially to believers. Like, let's really go and lean into it and honor God in our work and our service. And so it's all easy enough to say and everything. But then we have to face the reality that not all parents, not all people we serve are going to be perfect, ideal masters, perfect, ideal parents. We're going to face ungodly, we're going to face harsh authority as a result. And like, how do you deal with situations like that where, like, I've been called to obey them, and yet this person's ungodly, this person's harsh with me? How would God have me respond in those situations? And so one key idea that I learned from Dr. Cottle, like over the years, I've been poured into by many individuals that I've just had the opportunity to cross paths with. So one was Dr. Cottle. He's still actually alive, actually, an older individual. But he mentioned in one of the classes I took with him is that, life is 10% what happens to you and 90% of how you respond. And those choices, those responses we make are going to make a world of a difference in how God's going to be able to either use us and bless us, or it's going to have to knock us down a peg and bring correction to us to get us back on the right path so we reflect him correctly. And so when we are in those situations where you have a harsh boss, when you have harsh parents you have to deal with, how we respond to them is very of critical importance. And so the first thing we have to be reminded of when it comes from the Bible's perspective is that, again, as we read in Romans 13, all authority is appointed by God. So just because they're harsh and they're ungodly, that was a position God gave them. But that does not mean their behavior towards you is godly. That God did not tell them, hey, be cruel, beat them, speak negative words over them. That was never God's intent. But he did put them in that position, but the behavior is not from him. That's definitely not what he intended. So we have to be mindful of the fact that God will hold that leader responsible for their behaviors. There will be a day of accountability. They're going to stand before him and give an account for what they did. Those under us, those under them who have to deal with it in the meantime, are being tested. So the question is, in this time of difficulty, in this time of fire of being tested, am I going to honor them or am I going to dishonor them? And if we can find ourselves in that path of like, I'm going to obey and honor them in spite of how I feel about them right now, God's going to bless and reward us as a result. He's like, hey, you passed the test, you get a reward for doing doing the hard work here. And we see here too that, as always, Christ has left as an example what it looks like to suffer as a result, and saying, hey, you're not the only one doing this. I'm showing you an example of how you can walk through this and be successful when it's all said and done. So we see here, Peter writes in 1 Peter 2:21, for this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you might follow in his steps. And so we are called to live a life of handling unfair treatment correctly. Like, this is going to be a part of our life. The world is broken. We're going to deal with harsh and ungodly people, and we're called to suffer in a righteous manner before them and ultimately before God. And so Jesus did it with the authorities of his time, being brutally crucified for crimes he never committed as the Son of God. And he's like, hey, if the authorities of that time could be unjust and cruel towards me, and I walk through it and ultimately come out victorious on the other side and destroying death as a result, as followers, we're not going to avoid difficulty, we're not going to avoid suffering, but we can find victory through it as we submit correctly. So we want to honor people even when they are not likable as a result, but God can bless us in that. So how do we deal? What are a couple different tactics we can take when it comes to dealing with ungodly and harsh people? So one thing, of course, we can do is, especially as you get older as a kid, at some point you're going to move out of the house. You're no longer having to obey the day-to-day things like, hey, fix your room, go take the trash out kind of thing. But we can still honor them. And so we can always honor our parents from a distance. So maybe they're not the most helpful. Maybe they're the most toxic individual you can come across right now. They just want nothing to do with the Lord kind of thing. We can still honor them from a distance. We may not have to always obey them, but we can still at least honor them. Honor is the big thing here. And so one of the big stories when it comes to honoring someone in authority who is ungodly and harsh is David during the time of King Saul. For those of you who are familiar with the story of David and King Saul, Saul did not, as you can see in the photo, did not like the fact that David was the next king. Like, God had anointed him to be the next king, and he's like, I'm going to take you out. Like, I don't want you threatening my family line. I want Jonathan, my son, to be the next king, and I'll do whatever it takes to take you out. And so David's on the run for years in the wilderness. His life is being made miserable as Saul is hunting him down, trying to take his life because he doesn't want God's blessing that he had poured out on David to actually come to pass. And so there's two different times in the Bible where David is presented with the opportunity to kill Saul. Where it's like, there's nothing Saul could do. He's totally knocked out. He's vulnerable as can be. You can murder him right now and get to the kingship right now. You could take matters into your hand and become king as of today. And twice, David will pass the test and be like, I will not touch the Lord's anointed. Like, God appointed him to this position. I am not going to do anything to raise my hand against him. And he even talks about a situation where in the cave of Adullam, if I remember correctly, he actually cuts off the corner of Saul's cloak, or of his cloak. And even when he had done that, he said that he felt convicted in his heart very deeply that he had dishonored Saul just by cutting the corner of his robe. And he cut it just to show Saul, like, hey, I could have killed you, but I didn't. I just took a corner of your cloak. But even that little bit of damage to his clothing was an act of dishonor. He was just not comfortable. He's like, I'm just not going to touch this guy whatsoever. And so David just kept distance. He's just like, hey, I'm going to stay in the wilderness. We're not going to live together kind of thing. But I'm always going to speak peaceably about you. I'm not going to speak negative words against you. And I know it's a big thing today for those of you who are maybe more conservative leaning, may not care for our current leader of the country. We're inclined to say negative things about our leaders. We really should not be doing that. It's spiritually wrong. We need to really refrain from that type of behavior. Our way we honor people will come through not only our actions and our words, but also our thought life. Our spiritual behaviors are all connected, and God knows it all. We're going to give an account for everything we think, speak, and say. So we want to be mindful about that. So David never spoke negatively about Saul. He never physically attacked him. He just kept distance until God and his own timing took Saul out of the picture to let David step into the role. And so we want to follow David's example. Like, I'm just going to honor him. He even says, he refers to King Saul and says, you're my father. Like, my father, I've done nothing wrong to you. Like, he gives deference and honor to him while this man is making his life miserable for years on end. But God's training up David through all this and just giving us a fantastic example of what it looks like to honor someone who's really out to get you. So then the second key idea here is not only can we honor from a distance, but we want to be mindful that the Bible does, again, teach us unconditionally to honor those, to submit to authority, to honor those above us, but we're not to always unconditionally obey what they tell us to do. If someone tells you, hey, as you see in California, let's go raid Walgreens and just take whatever we want because, hey, it's under $1,000, no one's going to stop us. Like a parent telling a child to steal, a boss telling you, hey, fudge the numbers on a report. When they're calling you to sin, that's when we step back. We're like, okay, hey, I know I'm here to honor you, and I'm going to generally obey everything you say. But once you're asking me to do something that's clearly sinful, that I can't obey. So I'm still going to honor you. I'm respectful to you, but I cannot do what you're asking me to do. I have to respectfully decline. And so one of the key stories that you see this on graphic display, of course, will be Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how they handled their situation with King Nebuchadnezzar when asked to bow before a gold idol. And that, it's not a real god, but that's the god that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. I always feel bad for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because that's their Babylonian names. That's not the names they were born with. And so we remember them for these false names that they have in essence. This is a harder one, but for those who are Bible trivia nerds, does anybody know what their original names were? What was it? Meshach, yeah. Hananiah, another, yeah. What was it? Yeah, so yeah, it's one of those random things. So it's one of those random Bible trivia things I try to memorize just like for their own memory's sake. So it's so Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, I believe there. So they're Hebrew names. So I try to always have fun with that one. But yeah, so there's this whole situation. When Nebuchadnezzar plays the music, the band strikes up. Everyone's supposed to bow and worship the golden image made in Nebuchadnezzar's image. And of course, the second commandment is you shall not worship any idols. And so Daniel's friends know the commandments. They're like, hey, we ain't doing this. This is a total violation of God. We trust God with our life. And so we read here in, jump over to the next page here. Yeah, so Nebuchadnezzar's fiery test. So in Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 and 18, we see the response where so it says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. And so it's kind of easy to quickly read over this, but every time they say the phrase, O king, they are showing honor, they are showing respect to Nebuchadnezzar. It's like they understand his position as king over them, they understand he's the ruler and the assigned, appointed authority in their lives. So they're like, in total honor and respect, sir, we understand what you're asking for, it's not gonna happen. Like, we will not bow to this idol. This is a sin, I cannot move forward with what you're asking me to do. And so they trusted their lives to God, and hey, whatever happens, he can deliver us. He's almighty and all powerful, but even if he does, on the penalty of death, I'm not going to obey you in this sinful act as a result. And of course, God will show up, deliver them from this, and bless them actually as a result. Like they'll actually, because they pass this fiery test, they're going to get promoted in the kingdom. It's like, well, clearly God's here. You are God's followers, and so we're going to promote you in the kingdom. So sometimes when you go through those tests, God will actually use that to bring blessing, even further blessing in your life on the spot as a result. So you have those three guys to look to. It's like, how do we deal with unjust and harsh leaders? One is we can keep distance. Another one is, we're just going to say no. Like, I'm going to honor you, but I'm going to say no to the act of sin that you're asking me to do. So as I work towards bringing the message and this whole teaching on children and servants obeying, just because this whole idea of honor is super important. So I know we kind of started with those verses and kind of jumped to the bigger picture of like honor in general. The benefits of having proper honor with our parents, with our coworkers, and then of course this will ripple out in other teachings with Paul towards spiritual leaders, to governmental leaders. Honor is just got to be is a part of our life in all these relationships. When it is an unjust situation like David, like the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when we trust God and we still honor people rightly, we put that unjust situation in God's hands for him to justly. And you see here, we'll talk about in 1 Peter how God, how Christ himself, as he is being persecuted and being unjustly treated, even he kind of stays silent before Pilate and everything. He's like, I'm committing the case to God. God will judge justly in this situation and do what is right. And so even Jesus just committed his whole situation to God to take care of. So we put the situation into the right hands. Let God take care of it. Because if we step in and we're like, I'm going to fix the situation, I'm going to do what I think I understand is the right thing to do, then God's like, okay, I'm going to take my hands off of it, and you're going to reap whatever the consequences are. It's like, well, whatever I do is going to be subpar to whatever God could have accomplished if I just had let him step in and take the lead. So we want to let God take the lead here. Repeatedly again in our portion of Ephesians 1-9, Ephesians 6:1-9, and again we'll see in 1 Peter 3:9. We'll see again that as we go through difficulties and suffering and stuff like that, as long as we honor people, we will inherit a blessing. When we do things right, and when especially when it comes to honor and obeying people, as long as they're not asking us to sin again, as long as we honor them and obey them, we inherit a blessing. There is rewards to be received in this life and even going into eternity when we do things right. And then also at the same time, it's going to build godly character within us. So those fruits of the Spirit don't happen overnight. Like they talk about, like, a diamond, it's a piece of coal that's just been under a lot of pressure, and that pressure will transform it from a coal to an actual piece of diamond, and now it actually has greater value and worth. We're going to go through situations in life. They're going to put us under the fire. They're going to put pressure on us. And then because we respond rightly, we're going to become of greater value, greater use to the kingdom. And so we'll have works of gold and silver that will pass through the fire when we go to stand before the Lord one day, and not just works of hay and wood and stubble. So we want to honor. It's a big, big deal. Honor. It's just a pivotal thing in our successful walk. And so the last thing I just want to point is, like, where do we go from here with everything I've kind of just thrown into the air when it comes to about honor and obedience? And that is from 1 Timothy 2:1-2. The biggest encouragement we can walk away with is, first of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. This is good and is pleasing in the sight of our Savior. And so the point being here is we need to pray for those who are in authority over us, the good and the bad, because we're going to be under them at different points in our life. Ideally, hopefully, we'll be able to sidestep all the bad people. But when it comes to a job, sure, you can give a letter of resignation. You can kind of walk away from it, hopefully get to a better situation. But when it comes to parents, you really don't have a choice in that matter. It's just they've been appointed, and you have to work with what God has blessed you with in that regard, for good or bad. But we need to pray for them. And we know prayer is the most powerful thing we can do in this life. I know sometimes it's easy to say, oh, prayer, blah, blah, blah. It seems pointless. But it's like, no, that's the greatest spiritual weapon we have, is to pray. We're calling upon God. We're calling upon the forces that work on our behalf that we just don't see right now. And things happen that we just will only see on the other side of eternity. When we get to the other side and see God in glory, we're like, oh, this is what happened this whole time in a realm we just can't visually see right now. All these different things that are moving. Prayer is significant in changing people's hearts. And the Bible makes it clear, like, God holds the heart of the king in his hands. Like, he guides them in the decisions they make. So be it King Nebuchadnezzar, King Cyrus, our current president, God is working through those leaders, and our prayers can shape them to make correct decisions, whether it may be against their own personal desires. God can shape the course of history in a way that's like, no, the right thing will be done as long as we entrust and reach out to him. So we really want to pray for them. And so my two questions for you in concluding are, who is somebody that you have not prayed for that you should pray for, that's in authority over you? Like, to be intentional about praying for those who are in authority above us. And then who is someone that you have been resisting honoring, resisting obeying, that God has above you? So we want to be intentional about, like, acknowledging where have we been resistant to the will of God in our life, to be honoring people, and take the time to pray for them. And if we do have resentment built up against them, or whatever, maybe in one sense very justifiable. I mean, they did something that hurt you and harmed you, but we want to be able to release that, submit it before the Lord, and be like, God, I want you to take over the situation, this pain, this hurt that this leader did in my life. And I want to be in a place where I can rightly honor them so I can receive those blessings that you are offering in my life. And so we want to pray for those that we have not been praying for, and then release to the Lord those people who have hurt us, and to trust them to do right by us in that regard, but to be continually lifting them up in prayer and then rightly honoring them. And if this is something that you are interested in pursuing the topic more, and there's all kinds of teaching series on this. Two resources in particular I mentioned that I really highly recommend checking out would be Honor is Reward by John Bevere. He's also known for another book called The Bait of Satan, which talks about offense. But honor is such a big thing. So, like, if you really, I can't highly recommend that resource enough, and really just like getting that matter settled in your heart and your soul, and being able to walk out this Christian walk successfully. And then, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lesson about the whole sit, walk, stand, there's actually a book called Sit, Walk, Stand by Watchman Nee. And he's usually known for the normal Christian life. It's the book he's usually associated with. This would be another book along those lines, but it's a specific study on the book of Ephesians that he did that I would recommend. But with that, let me go ahead and pray real quick over us, and then I'll turn things back over to Stefan.